Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli recording for students in Anatomy and Physiology 1 at Madison Area Technical College for the fall 2020 semester. The first topic that we'll cover is organization of the human body, and there's a study guide question that goes along with this lecture, which I'm going to show you right now for just a second. It's this first question, which shows that you need to know how to define the terms anatomy and physiology, list the major levels of organization, which we'll go over, and you need to be familiar with the 11 anatomical organ systems. We'll also talk about how anatomy varies amongst different individuals. So to continue with our lecture, first thing I'd like to do is to take a step back and think about what we're learning in this course. I'm sure that you already know that the title Anatomy and Physiology refers to learning about the human body and how it works. More specifically, the word anatomy means to cut apart. That's because this is the way that anatomy was studied originally, historically, through dissection. Now we use the term anatomy really to refer to form or structure. More correctly, we would use the word morphology. That's a little bit harder to say. And then physiology means the study of function. Literally, it means to study the natural processes that occur. So in this class, we'll be studying both the structure of the human body and the processes that occur in the human body. It's really ideal that we teach both at the same time because the two subdisciplines, anatomy and physiology, are really inseparable. In many universities, they're taught as separate courses, but I like that our school teaches them together because they complement one another. On this slide, you can see an example of how they are comparable in that the heart has a structure that reflects exactly how it's going to function. Notice that it has valves that that allow blood to move from one chamber to the next. These heart valves will only open in one direction, and therefore blood will only flow in one direction, which is ideal because we need it to flow directly to the lungs, or if it's oxygenated, to the rest of the body. So form and function are very complementary. Okay, now we're ready to look at how the body is organized overall. And in this course, as well as in A&P2, you're going to be introduced to a lot of different organs, tissues, and cells, as well as how they work. On this slide, you can see how varied these structures are. Everything from the lungs to the liver, the eye, muscles in the hands, the intestines, blood cells, even small molecules like I believe this is a carbohydrate down at the bottom. And we can look at this piecemeal and just go through every single organ, cell, or tissue, but there's really an organization to our body, and if we follow that organization, it's not nearly as confusing for us. So we're going to look at the human body in a hierarchical sort of scheme, which starts with the whole organism. So we have a picture here of a baby, if you will, and the baby is the organism, of course, and the baby is made up of several different organ systems. So, for example, shown here, we have the organ system, the intestine, right here. the digestive system. And inside the digestive system, there's several organs. There's the liver, the stomach, the large intestine, and then the small intestine. If we just look at one of those organs, the stomach, for example, we will see that the stomach is made up of multiple different types of tissues. One tissue type lines the inside of the stomach. So that's one tissue type. And then tissues are also made up of multiple structures called cells. And there are different types of cells that make up this lining, as well as all the different tissues in the organ, the stomach. Inside cells, we have smaller structures that perform various functions inside the cell, and these are called organelles. The one that's shown here is a mitochondria, and it makes ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. Also inside the organelle are molecules that perform various functions like ATP. The one shown on this picture, however, is a picture of DNA because mitochondria have one chromosome, so one molecule of DNA floating inside the space of the mitochondria. DNA is a huge molecule. We call it a macromolecule for that reason. It's organic, meaning it's carbon-based, and it's made up of smaller subunits that we refer to as molecules. And of course, molecules are made up of atoms. So we can either go from large to small or small to large, and we will do both in this course. So in lecture, we're going to start at the atomic level and work our way up to organ systems. But in lab, we're going to start with an organ system and we're going to work our way to tissues. So organ systems are groups of organs that work together to provide a certain function, like the digestive system, which can break down our nutrients. The stomach in particular breaks down proteins for us. Inside the small intestine now, so this is a different part of the digestive system, we see that there are different tissue types. So lining the small intestine is a certain tissue type, and then we have another layer of tissue, and then a muscular layer, and then another layer of tissue here. So the small intestine has multiple tissue types, and the one that's innermost that absorbs our nutrients is epithelial tissue. And then the muscle layer, the muscle tissue that's in there, helps to propel materials through the small intestine. Now within that epithelial layer, the innermost layer of either the stomach or the small intestine, you will find various types of cells. So many tissues, not every tissue, but most tissues have different types of cells. They all have multiple cells, but they may all do the same thing. In the case of this epithelial tissue, or epithelium, which we call it here, there's many different cell types. There are some cells that absorb nutrients. Those are the absorptive cells that are shown in purple. There are some goblet cells. They looked like wine goblets to somebody, so they named them goblet cells. They make mucus. There are enteroendocrine cells that make hormones. And then, of course, there's some immune cells that help fight any kind of foodborne infection we might encounter. Those are called Paneth cells. At this point in the course and in your study of anatomy and physiology, you do not need to know that the small intestine epithelium has exactly these types of cells. Rather, what I'd like to get across to you is that a tissue has many different types of cells, and that's all. But I thought you'd like an example. So if we look at just one of those absorptive cells, for example, or a Paneth cell, we could look at any of the cell types. If we looked under a microscope, we might see individual structures. And those individual structures are called organelles, and each organelle has a very specific role for this cell to do what it's supposed to do, like absorb a nutrient or help fight some sort of an infection, which is what the Paneth cell does. So the organelles that are shown that are easily seen anyway would be the nucleus. That's where DNA is found, our hereditary information. And then these little structures, these little balls inside the cytoplasm, are called secretory vesicles. And they will help the cell release a material, some kind of compound that the body needs elsewhere. So those are secretory vesicles. And then also visible on the kind of diagram on the top are many other organelles, like this blue structure that surrounds the nucleus is the endoplasmic reticulum. And we'll talk about that. It has a lot to do with proteins being made inside the cell, as well as lipids. So we'll talk about that later. So even organelles can be broken down or partitioned into subunits, structural subunits, which do have different functions. For example, let's just take the membrane of a cell. That's also kind of an organelle. It's at least a part of a cell. I don't know if I'd call it an organelle, but it's the boundary of the cell. It's actually made up of a certain kind of molecule, certain macromolecule, which is called a phospholipid, but it has proteins embedded in it as well. So this is a cross-section showing you a cross-section of the cell membrane. And what you see are phospholipids here and here, 2 layers, and then some purple proteins that are really big that are embedded inside the membrane. And each has a certain function, which we'll talk about later. So the macromolecules have different functions. One I wanted to mention is the triglyceride. That's going to be one of the questions that you're going to answer on your first assignment, I think. A triglyceride you've probably heard of because often we have our triglycerides in our blood measured at the doctor, but you're so young, probably not yet, but when you get older you will. And a triglyceride is a type of a lipid that's made up of individual subunits called fatty acids. So you'll notice that this triglyceride has a backbone, and then it has 3 repeating units. Okay, and those repeating units are referred to as fatty acids. And the fatty acids provide a good barrier for the cell. So you'll see that the cell membrane has fatty acids, but also it's a great energy storage molecule because there's so many bonds present in fatty acids and in triglycerides in general. So that's the hierarchy, which I can just review for you briefly. We start with the largest organism, or the largest category, which is the organism, which is made up of individual organ systems. One organ system is made up of many different organs. One organ is made up of many different tissues. And a single tissue type, muscle tissue for example, is made up of many different cells. A single cell has many different organelles inside, and an organelle is made up of different large molecules that can be broken down into smaller molecules and then finally into individual atoms. That's the smallest unit. Okay, the next part of our lecture we'll review organ systems, and there's 11 different organ systems that you're going to learn. On this slide what you see are the lymphatic system, the respiratory system, digestive system, urinary system, and then the reproductive systems in the male and the female. Since you're human, you're familiar with all of these, and maybe not the lymphatic so much, but the rest you are. And each organ system is adapted to provide a different general function for the body. Okay, everything from obtaining oxygen and getting rid of CO2, which is what the respiratory system does, to eliminating urine, okay, which is what the urinary system does. So each organ system has a special function. You need to be able to name the 11 anatomical organ systems and give, I will say, I said 2 in your study question, but even just 1 is okay. A major function of each organ system and the principal organs. So that'll be really easy for some and a little bit more difficult than others. So let's start with a list of the 11 organ systems. They include the integumentary system, the skeletal system, the muscular system, the nervous system, the endocrine system, the circulatory system, the lymphatic system, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive. So you have to sort of, count on your fingers and be able to name those. Now they all have individual functions, but there is some overlap in the sense that there may be multiple organ systems that contribute to the same overall general function. Really general functions though, not very specific. So for example, we could say that these 3 organ systems are involved with protecting or supporting the body in some way. So the integumentary system, of course, forms a barrier between our internal environment and the external environment. The skeletal system protects organs. For example, think of the rib cage that protects the lungs and the heart. And the muscular system, although it does produce movement, which is a little bit different than the other 2, it also is protective of the skeletal system and joints in particular. And it gives the body an overall girth, if you will, or thickness. It also, when the muscles contract, they produce heat, so that heat protects us from getting too cold. There are 2 organ systems that are worthy of my mention, and that is because they both regulate other organ systems. So these organ systems have their own functions, but the overreaching effect of those functions are to control what other organ systems do. For example, the nervous system is one of these, and the nervous system controls muscular contraction, so it controls the muscular system. The nervous system is involved with controlling other things as well. The endocrine system is the other organ system that controls many organ systems in the body by producing hormones. Okay, so the hormones will circulate throughout the body and have an effect on different organs. And as the hormone travels through the bloodstream, many different target cells will be stimulated, so hormones will have a widespread effect. And we'll learn about these 2 organ systems in greater detail around the middle of the semester. There are 2 organ systems that are involved with fluid transport. You're probably most familiar with the circulatory system because the fluid inside the circulatory system is blood, and we're pretty familiar with that. One thing that's interesting though is as our blood is pumped out to our peripheral tissues, we lose a little bit of plasma to the cellular environment. So your whole blood volume diminishes a little bit every time your heart beats. However, that fluid is recaptured and sent back into the circulatory system. And it's done so, it happens because the lymphatic system captures that lost fluid in its lymphatic vessels and then deposits it back into a vein close to the heart. So they're both involved with fluid transport. There's obviously multiple organ systems that are involved in defending us against infection. We've already talked about the integumentary system, which provides a barrier preventing pathogens from penetrating. But the lymphatic system also participates in that, in protection. in immune protection because it has lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes contain cells that fight harmful infectious agents. So you might have heard of antibody production. Those antibodies are made by B cells, which might be living in lymph nodes, for example. There's also multiple organ systems that exchange substances between our bodies and the environment. And when it does so, this helps keep nutrients inside, wastes are expelled. It also helps keep moisture in our body, maintain a certain body temperature, and multiple other things. So there's 3 organ systems that interact with our external environment. First is the digestive system. It's adapted to take in nutrients and expel wastes into the environment. The respiratory system is adapted to take in oxygen from the environment and expel carbon dioxide as a waste product. The urinary system filters our blood and eliminates any waste products from the blood. I'll call them toxic metabolites, but they become part of urine, and the bladder and urethra expel the urine into the environment. Of course, the reproductive systems have a certain function. That's reproduction. No surprise there. But they also have organs that are responsible for hormone production. Now, the last topic for this particular introductory lecture is about how anatomy varies between humans. No 2 humans are exactly alike. Generally, 70% of humans have a similar or same anatomical form, but there are variations in certain regions of the body, and 30% of the population will have a variation of some sort. And I'd like to just show you a couple of examples. Sometimes an individual has a different number of organs or structures. So normal function, but just not as many organs. For example, missing muscles or extra vertebrae. Usually it's not a major muscle. Usually and we have a lot of synergistic muscles anyway. Or maybe they are just born with 1 kidney, but they're fine. Another variation that can occur is that the organ or organs might be in a different location than you see in 70% of the population. This is really common, more than 30%, I think, when you think of how arteries and veins branch throughout the body. That varies to some degree in everyone. But there are more extreme examples, like having a kidney placed further down into the pelvis than normal. Or in some cases, the liver and the stomach are reversed, and I'll show you a few examples of this. So anatomical variation involving the kidney would be, or kidneys I should say, is that normally they're pretty high up, just at the very inferior border of the rib cage in the back there. So they're paired, one on the right, one on the left. And sometimes one of the kidneys or both of the kidneys are much more inferior, and they're down in the pelvic region. So this one is lower. Sometimes an individual is born where they don't have 2 separate kidneys. Instead, the kidneys develop as one. They never actually separate. So it's called a horseshoe-shaped kidney. I don't actually know how prevalent that is. Percentage-wise, enough to be in a textbook anyway. And then the really common variation that I mentioned before has to do with how vessels branch and reach their targets throughout the body. So normally what we see from the heart is a very large artery called the aorta. You might have heard of the aorta before. Normally this arched vessel has 3 major branches coming off of it. You'll learn the name of those in A&P2. Well, in some cases, instead what you'll have are 2 major branches coming off, or maybe 4 major branches coming off. But usually, to compensate for this, further branching occurs a little bit farther away from the arch of the aorta. So it's not that there's going to be, a lack of blood supply somewhere. It's just that the branching is different. And my final example of anatomical variation deals with this reversal of organ position. So there's one particularly sort of prevalent case called situs inversus. 1 in 8,000 people have it, and in this case the liver and the stomach are reversed. So normally the liver is on the right side of the body. So when you're looking at a picture like this, this is the right side and this is the left side, and so the stomach is over here on the left side. In 1 out of 8,000 people, those 2 are reversed. The rest of the organs might also, abdominal organs might also be reversed, like the way the intestine flows, but usually not. And then there's another example called dextrocardia, where just the heart is reversed. So normally the apex of the heart, or the point, points towards the left side, but in dextrocardia the point is pointing to the right side. So what that means is usually the right side of the heart takes blood to the lungs and the left side of the heart takes blood to the rest of the body. That would just be reversed in dextrocardia, but function would still be normal. There are instances where both the heart and the abdominal organs are inverted or reversed, if you will, which has a special name, but it's not nearly as common. So that's the end of study question number 1, topics, and if you have any questions, you can talk to me during the live session about that or send an email. Thank you.